This is Dr. Weisslogel, and this is a brief presentation on some background material in your studies of Immanuel Kant and his ideas about morality and ethics. In order to understand what Kant's project is when it comes to moral philosophy and ethics, we have to have some background information on the idea of substance, the philosophical idea of substance. Now, when a philosopher talks about substance, a philosopher is talking about real things, substantial being, what's really real. And over time, philosophers have changed their ideas about the meaning of substance and therefore about what is really real. And when we change our ideas about what's really real, we may end up changing our ideas about how it is best for certain kinds of things to be, in particular the kind of things that we are, human beings. So let's take a look at that. On an ancient or a medieval view, that would be a view that would be common to Aristotle, let's say, and St. Thomas Aquinas, a view that was held for a very long time. A substance is not just a material. It's not just concrete or steel or wood. It's not meant in that sense. It means that which is apt to exist in itself. In other words, it doesn't exist as an intrinsic part of something else, but it's a whole thing that exists in its own right. And it's an abiding center of activity, a center of activity that lasts and endures throughout change. And in this case, activity means both acting or being acted upon. So think about anything that's real. If it stays what it is throughout change, if you could tell what it is and where it leaves off and what everything else is, if you could distinguish it from other things. This is what the ancients and the medievals meant by a substance or a substantial being or something that exists substantially. Now, certain things can be parts of other things, but not intrinsically. So I might have some things that are part of the materials that I use to create PowerPoints or work at my desk on papers. But those different things, the computer, maybe the headset, a pen or a notebook, well, they're not intrinsic parts of anything else. They are each their own thing. So if that's the definition of substance, that which is apt to exist in itself and not as an intrinsic part of anything else, whole things existing in their own right, well then, how many substances would there be in the universe on that view? And the answer is approximately lots and lots. I don't know if it's an infinite number because I don't have the time to count everything in the universe, but we know it's a lot. We know even just in looking around your room, in a way, every book, every pen, your chair, your desk, your laptop, each one of these things would count as a substance. Now, in a metaphysics course, we could talk a lot about different kinds of substances, and are there some substances that are more foundational or primary than other substances. But for our purposes, let's get the gist of this view. On this view, there's lots and lots of substances. And each one of those substances has its own form, as we learned from Plato, or its own formal cause, as we learned in Aristotle, its own nature, its own final cause, or end, or aim, or goal, or purpose, its own place in the universe, its own best way for it to be, because each of these substances are essentially different from each other, and they have their own way of being and their own best way of being. So on this definition of substance, we could develop a sort of a broader view of what the cosmos itself is all about. The cosmos is richly populated with many, many different substantial beings, each with its own formal cause and its own final cause. The cosmos is teleologically and hierarchically ordered. What that means is the Greek word for final, as in final cause, is telos. So a teleological explanation of something is to explain something in terms of its ends or aims or goals or purposes. A classic example would be if you ask for a teleological explanation of why it rains, you say something like, because the grass needs to grow. You explain the rain in terms of what purposes it may serve. Now, it's not how we do things today, and that's part of what we're talking about in this presentation. The cosmos is also hierarchically ordered. That means some things are better, higher, richer, more important than other things by their very nature. It's not the case that all things are equally the same, because they're all different, and different does not mean automatically equal. The cosmos is home. Everything has its place. but things aren't equal. To be the best you could be, whatever you are, you should stay in your place, because that place is an indication of the kind of thing that you are. Science, on this view of the cosmos, is all about classifying things, finding out the different forms or types of things that they are, and learning how it's best for those kinds of things to be. And being and the good on this view are intimately connected. If you know what a thing is, you automatically know how it's best for that thing to be, or at least in principle you can know how it's best for that thing to be if you're willing to study it, because what a thing is, in a sense, indicates the way it's best for that kind of thing to be. And politics, on this view, is about the search for the philosopher monarch, the philosopher king, as we say, or philosopher queen, the person who would be best qualified, who would know, and not just have an opinion about how it's best for things to be. And, as we learned on the ancient view, no one does evil knowingly, and our problems are all a function of our basic ignorance that needs to be overcome. And the one who has overcome would be the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, the one who might be truly wise, and that would be the best person to have organizing and ruling and governing the polis, because that person would do things as it was best for everyone, and not just for herself or himself. So politics would be about finding the person who's best qualified. And philosophy, on this ancient view, is mainly, predominantly about metaphysics. What are things really? What is the basic structure of reality? What is the essence or nature of things? That's what philosophy pursued. Now, on the modern view of substance, that definition changes. It may not seem like it changes a lot, but how it changes everything. So on the modern view, substance is that which is apt to exist by itself. Remember, the ancient view was that which is apt to exist in itself. Well, by itself is something completely different. That means that which needs nothing other than itself in order to exist. That's a definition that came to be taken over in philosophy and in theology. It's quite interesting. We can trace the change in the definition of substance due to a theological concern for the omnipotence of God. As we learned with Aristotle, form and matter are not two things that are smashed together to form something else. You and I and everything that's real is just one thing, but we can think about it in terms of its form, what kind of a thing it is, or in terms of its material cause, what the thing is made of. All real things are made of something, and all real things are some kind of something. But it doesn't mean that all real things are a combination of two things, one of which is form and one of which is substance. But a theologian might have a concern to say, well, what do you mean you couldn't separate form and matter? Couldn't God do whatever God felt like doing, including separating things like form and matter, or maybe separating things from their properties, their accidental features? Substance is that which has properties. So if you take a book, let's say, well, it has certain properties. It weighs a certain amount, it's a certain kind of color, a certain size, and you can't separate the book from its weight. You can't say, give me the book, but don't give me the weight, or I'd like to have the book, but not its color, or give me that book there, but not its size. You can't really do that. But what about God? Wouldn't God be able to separate the substance from its accidental features like weight and size and color? Anyway, again, theologians and metaphysicians get concerned about this kind of stuff, but the important thing is the definition got accepted. Now, to be real is to be that which can exist by itself and need nothing other than itself in order to exist. So how many things can you think of that need nothing other than itself in order to exist? Well, how about this book? Does this book need nothing other than itself in order to exist? Well, you might say, well, there it is on the desk. Nobody needs to do anything. It's there. It doesn't need any help. But where did it come from? Didn't it need to come from whoever wrote the book and whoever published the book and whoever gathered the paper to print the pages on and whoever made the ink? Well, of course. So if you think about it that way, how many things are there that need nothing other than themselves in order to exist? None. Maybe one. Maybe God needs nothing other than God's self in order to exist. But notice the big difference. On the old definition, the ancient definition of substance, there were lots of kinds of things and each had its own way of being. Now, maybe there aren't any real things, or maybe there's only one real thing, like God. And that begs the question, well, if there's only one real thing like God or nature, what do we make of all this stuff? Is it an illusion? Is it just a manifestation of God, a manifestation of the one thing called nature? Well, again, these are big problems for metaphysics, but it's going to have interest for us in how we think about ethics, surprisingly. Now, we can attribute a lot of this change to the modern world to René Descartes. You might have heard of him from math class, Cartesian geometry. He was a mathematician, very interested in geometry. And Descartes, above all things, wanted certainty. He wanted to know, what could he know for sure? Now, if you think about that, you could see a big change in Descartes' view of what philosophy was all about. In the ancient world, philosophy was about metaphysics. What's really real? How are things fundamentally? What is the basic structure and nature of reality? For Descartes, it was about Descartes. He thought the fundamental question is, what can I know? Not what is there really, but what can I know? And he used a method of radical doubt to try to attain this certainty. His idea was pretty simple. He said, I will doubt anything that I possibly could doubt. Not what I do actually doubt as an ordinary person, but I'm using this as a philosophical technique to help me find out if there's anything about which I could be absolutely sure. And he would say, well, anything that could appear to my mind as clear and distinct was in fact unable to be doubted. It was indubitable. So he wanted to try to find out if there's anything that he could understand clear and distinctly and therefore know with certainty. That was his goal. Now, mathematicians like certainty, don't you think? I mean, 2 plus 3 is not about 5 or kind of 5 or sort of 5. It's exactly 5 with certainty for everybody, for all times. Wouldn't it be great, the mathematical mind says, if everything could be known with the same kind of certainty? Wouldn't that be terrific? And Descartes, in some ways, wants to find out how much he could really be certain about. So, what could he doubt? Well, he could doubt what people have told him or taught him. Of course he could. People disagree. They're mistaken. What about what he reads in books? Sure, one person writes a book saying you should vote for this party, another person writes a book saying you shouldn't vote for this party. One person writes a book saying this is the way the economy should be organized, another person writes a book says that's not the way, this is this other way. Of course, they completely disagree. So you can't be certain. What about what he sees with his eyes? We all say, like, seeing is believing, and he says, well, it's not that I have to doubt my senses right now as a practical matter, but in fact, my senses have deceived me. On a hot day, I look down the road and I see a puddle of water, but as I get closer, I realize it's not water at all. It's an optical illusion. Or I take a stick and I dip it in a pond and it looks like it's bending, but that's just the refraction of the light. It's not really bending. Or how about people at a distance? I think that's my friend Joe up there in the crowded mall, and I yell out, "Hey, Joe!" and person turns around, it's not Joe at all. I'm completely embarrassed by it, right? I've made mistakes depending on my senses to tell me what's real. So remember, Descartes is not practically doubting his senses or what he reads or what people tell him. What he's saying is, how do I know for sure that these things are true? As a practical matter, I generally accept them as true, but how do I know with certainty that they're true? That's my project, he says. Even what about like right now? What about what's right up close? Can you doubt that? And he says, well, I can. And he very famously gives this argument called we now know it as the dream argument, where he basically says, well, I see a book. How can I be sure I've seen a book? Haven't I had a dream? And in the dream, hasn't it seemed like there was a book right in front of me? If you're me, I dream about books, whatever you dream about. Descartes says, how do I know that I'm not dreaming now? I mean, I don't believe I'm dreaming, but how do I know I'm not dreaming? When I'm dreaming, everything seems real. When that dog's chasing me down the street in my dream, I feel the fear, the panic. I'm running, I'm sweating, heart's pounding. It seems real at the time. How do I know I'm not going to just wake up out of this moment that I'm in now? I think I'm preparing a class for you, recording a class, but how do I know I'm not just dreaming that? And then he says, well, what about math? I mean, what about 2 plus 3 equals 5? What about the truths of reason? Could I ever even be wrong about those? And he says, well, I could. And then he gives you another very famous argument or hypothesis. He says, okay, so what if there's an evil demon who's both all powerful and all cunning? I mean, how do I know there's not some evil demon or genius who's without my being able to catch him doing it, is making me think things like 2 plus 3 equals 5, or making me, think that I'm here. I mean, what about that? And again, he doesn't really think there's an evil demon as a practical matter. He's doing a what if. He's hypothesizing. He says, okay, just suppose there is such a thing. Wouldn't that, couldn't I be being tricked? Okay, maybe you don't like that evil demon hypothesis, but here's something we can do. We can take you down to an operating room, insert some electrodes in your brain, hook them up to a computer, run a program, and you will feel like you smell hot apple pie in the oven. Now, there's no apple pie around, but we know how your brain works to the extent that we could make you experience a sensation of smell, even though there's nothing there actually causing the smell. We know how to do that. Just imagine if our computer program was much, much better than it is. How do you know you're not hooked up to a machine right now with a very richly elaborate computer program that's creating your entire reality when in fact you're just lying on an operating table, or a brain in a vat, as they have called it in other philosophical discussions? I mean, how do you know that? Or, have you ever seen the movie The Matrix? Okay, there would be no such movie without Descartes' famous philosophical thought experiment about the evil demon. So he pushes skepticism to its most radical levels. Say, is there anything left? Isn't there anything that I can be certain about? And his answer is, you know what? It isn't the case that everything is doubtable. There is something that I can be sure of. Not everything is indubitable. And this is the famous I think, therefore I am argument. We discussed arguments in this class. There's a premise, I think. There's a conclusion, I am, or I exist. My reason for knowing with certainty that I exist is that I think, or have various modes of thought. So what about the evil demon? Could he be tricking me into thinking? Descartes says no. So it doesn't matter if what I think is true or what I think is a deception. If I'm thinking, even if I think something's incorrect, if I'm thinking, then I must exist. I exist as a thinking thing. The one thing that cannot be doubted is the fact that I'm doubting. Doubting is a mode of thinking, so when I doubt, I'm thinking. Everything I think might be wrong. It doesn't matter. So long as I think, I am. I exist. Exist as what is a good question. Because not as, for instance, René Descartes, who was a Frenchman who lived in the 17th century, who was a mathematician, who was a soldier of fortune and a mercenary and did all kinds of other interesting things, interested in all that, he could be wrong. All of that, some evil genius may be making him think. He could be wrong about all that stuff, but he can't be wrong about the fact that he is a thinking thing, or a res cogitans in Latin. That's it. A thinking thing needs nothing other than itself to be right or to exist in order for it to exist. So thinking is a substance on the modern view. It needs nothing other than itself in order to exist. So don't say, well, wait a minute, doesn't thinking need a brain? Descartes would say, well, that's a hypothesis. Even that may be a deception. I mean, I think once upon a time people thought with other bodily organs. Well, now we're pretty sure we think with our brain, or our central neurological system, central nervous system, connected to it perhaps. Well, maybe something else will show that that's wrong. I doubt it, but it could. Right? But the fact that I think, thinking as an immaterial, unextended, not a part of nature, thinking is what I fundamentally am. I think. Now, is there anything else that Descartes could be certain about? Turns out the answer is yes. That's not the only thing. He says every experience I have of something in the world, whether the source of that something be a perceptual object out there, or a memory, or imagination, or hallucination, it really doesn't matter. It always comes in a certain kind of form. And he refers to that as it comes in the form of having parts outside of parts. and this is what we call in philosophy extension, or res extensa. And his point is, if you see an apple, remember an apple, imagine an apple, hallucinate an apple, in every case, the apple has a top part, a bottom part, a left part, and a right part. That's what he means by parts. So take this briefcase. It doesn't mean parts that you can take apart, but just, as this picture shows, I could say, look at that left part near the center, or look at the part up in the upper right. That's what he means by parts. It's not parts that you could take apart, but parts that you can point to, that you can map. You cannot have an experience of anything that does not have parts outside of parts. You can't picture a basketball that doesn't have a top, a bottom, and a left and right. Even a teeny tiny atom-sized basketball has a top of it, a bottom of it, left and right. If it didn't have any extension, it would not exist. It would be invisible. So what do we end up with? Well, extended substance, parts outside of parts. It's mappable, just what a geometer looking for certainty would be all about. And this understanding of parts outside of parts, or extension, is the basis of our material world. It needs nothing other than itself in order to exist. What's behind that extension? Who can say at this point in Descartes' argument? Are they real things, they figments of our imagination, a trick of the evil demon? Doesn't matter. There's still parts outside of parts. So we end up with now just two real things that can exist by themselves, just two, and this is known as the philosophical position of dualism, that there's just two things: thinking substance, which is immaterial and does not have parts outside of parts, and extended substance, the kind that does have parts outside of parts. And this, of course, says, well, what about God? Well, Descartes says I can prove God, and he does have to prove God, but only after he proves himself as a thinking substance, and after he proves some notion of the world that's all about parts outside of parts and extension. But he has to prove God because he needs, in a way, a cosmic insurance agent to say, well, you know what, God's all powerful, God's all good, and because God is, that would show there's not just some kind of evil demon who's always deceiving me, and this guards against the possibility of radical skepticism. So on the basis of the two things I'm certain of, plus the certainty that God must exist because I have the idea of God within me, and I couldn't have given it to myself, I have a basis for what I know, a basis for knowledge that's absolutely certain. Thinking substance, extended substance, and then, in a way, God, as certainties that I can build all my knowledge back on top of. Okay, so this dualism leads to a certain set of distinctions. You can already hear the first one, the difference between mind and body. And of course that's left philosophers with a big problem for centuries. For those who accept this dualism of Descartes, how does an immaterial mind drive around in a physical body? I mean, how does it push on that? Well, that's a big problem. But it didn't just leave us that problem. It gave us our distinctions of an inner person and an outer body. A distinction between our senses and emotion and reason and rationality. And you might think, well, why is reason and rationality on the extension side of the distinction here and not on the thought side? Well, what Descartes going to want to say is that the truth, scientific truth, is a truth that's determined by rationality. And your senses and emotions are private. They're not publicly available things that you can test. If you say you're angry, I guess you could exhibit anger, but it's not the basis of how we know things. The basis of how we know things are reason and rationality. Truth is determined by science and mathematics, and it puts religion and ethics on the private side of things. And so today, when somebody says, this is right or this is wrong, and somebody else says, well, who's to say? Or that's just your opinion. This is a claim that has its roots in Descartes' dualism that says our private opinions about what's good are not provable the way we prove things about the physical, extended material world with math and science. And so we tend to think of them as less true, less certain, less secure than our scientific truths. The qualities of life are thought to now be opinion. Only the quantity, the measurable, publicly mappable descriptions of the world are thought to be rational and scientific and important. So what that ends up doing is, well, it's interesting that even though the extension side has been privileged by our institutions, including the university, it's thought that has made this distinction, and so this basis of our scientific knowledge in this publicly available rationality and truth that comes from science and math itself is a function of thought. That's something to ponder for another day. But we get a different view of the universe on this modern view. Now the universe is a cosmos. It's not a home. It's not a teleologically ordered hierarchy with everything in its place. No, now the universe is infinite. It's got no boundaries. You don't know where you are in the universe because there's no edges to map yourself from. You have no absolute way of knowing who you are and what matters. The universe is now thought to just be mechanically ordered. What was the human being on the ancient view? Well, the human being was an embodied soul with a certain form and a certain set of functionality and a certain final cause ordered towards happiness. Now what's a human being? 79, 95 worth of chemicals and a lot of water. It's a machine. It's a mechanical thing that we look at on an operating table. We take apart, we put back together again, but we don't think there's any essential purpose for human beings. All things now obey just one set of mathematical physical laws. We think of things as in a sense, equally subject to these laws. I throw a rock out the window, it falls. I throw a student out the window, and the student falls. Well, it's just physics. It's just the mechanical way of the world. There's only one kind of causality, and that's efficient causality. One billiard ball knocking into another. There's no formal cause that tells you what kind of thing you essentially are. There's no final cause that tells you your end or aim or goal or purpose. No, you just you're one sort of domino in a bunch of dominoes that have been knocking each other over since the Big Bang or the beginning of time. Science now is the result of experimental method of observation, empiricism, and peer review. It's not just mere classification. We want to know the mechanism for why things happen. Being and the good, and this is important for us, are severed from each other. What you are is a physical, anatomical body. That's what you are. What's good for you? Well, that's a private opinion of your own, what's good. Who's to say what's good? Everybody can agree what you are. Your physical body, a human being, an animal of a certain kind. But what's good for you? Well, now that's just a matter of opinion. And because we're all stuck in opinion, politics now is not about finding the one who knows, because the good is a matter of opinion, not a matter of knowledge. So politics now becomes about democracy, where all of us are equal and protected by our rights that come from our own private internal thing that we are, isolated from everything else as a thinking substance. Philosophy becomes more about epistemology, what can I know, than it is about metaphysics, what are things really. The world has changed in its viewpoint a lot, and it has implications for ethics. I think probably the key one is this idea that for Descartes, what you are is a thinking thing, not fundamentally, essentially connected to your body. What that does is it isolates us from each other. What I can know about you is your extended body, but I can't know you. I can't really connect with you because you are other than me and different from me as this isolated, immaterial, disconnected thinking thing that we each are. And so the political project in the modern world is to try to figure out how are we going to get together. Whereas Aristotle, as we learned, said that we're social and political beings by nature. We're already connected. All we need, I don't need to prove your existence, or I don't have any reason to doubt your being. You and I, on Aristotle's view, are human beings, and we're intimately connected socially, communally, politically, and our job is to live well together. That's our job. We don't have to have an argument about why we should come together. And that has profound implications for ethics and politics. It also, this modern view explains our wall of separation between science and religion that we read about almost every day, it seems like. And the person who sort of pushed this was David Hume, who died right around the time of the American Revolution. He was an empiricist, and empiricism holds that there's no knowledge that does not come through the senses, and that if that's true, you can't, with your senses, find God or the soul, or causes via the senses. So, okay, the modern view is, well, maybe we don't need God anymore, but what about the soul? What about Descartes' thinking thing that you can't see or smell or touch or grab onto because it's immaterial? But even the fundamental key linchpin of science, knowing the cause of something, Hume says, well, you can't even find a cause via the sense. I mean, his famous example is, it's a hot day, there's macadam, and when the sun comes out, the macadam heats up, and every normal person, not bothered by philosophy, says the sun caused the macadam, the blacktop of the road, to get hot. And Hume says, I see the sun, I see the road, I feel the road, I can't experience a cause. I can't. I don't. Where's that thing called the cause? All I see is coincidence. Tends to be a constant conjunction of the sun being out and the road being hot, but I can't prove I can't see there's a cause. It's a very skeptical view that he has there, right? So, okay, so just one more thing to lead us into Kant here. Kant says that, in response to this being awoken from his dogmatic slumber, and you can see this in the written notes, a longer description of this. He says, I had to do something, Kant says, I had to do something in philosophy to save science from Hume's skepticism, to save ethics and morality from Hume's skepticism about the soul and God. I mean, if those things aren't really out there in the world, waiting to be discovered as the grounds for our science and the grounds for ethics, what are we going to do? And he said, well, I got to make a radical change. And he says, think about astronomy. Before Copernicus, people thought the Earth was in the center of everything and the sun went around the outside of it. And because that's exactly what it looks like. You stand outside, you say, look at me standing still, look at that sun moving across the sky, it must be going around me. That's an optical illusion. After Copernicus, he said, no, really what's happening is that we're rotating on our axis and revolving around the sun, and it makes it look like we're standing still because everything's moving the same speed we are, so we can't tell how fast we're going or that we're spinning. But basically that's what's going on, and we can see, now understand this optical illusion. But this change that Copernicus showed us in astronomy didn't result in a change of experience. I mean, you stand outside and it looks like the sun's going around you, but the fact is your understanding of it's changed, and when it changed, we could figure out how to go fly around in outer space, which we couldn't do before because we had a bad understanding of why things look the way they look. Well, Kant wants to do the same thing in ethics. He wants to say it looks like, that there's a certain nature, human nature out there waiting to be discovered that's going to ground what we are. It looks like, causes are out there in the world, but it's an optical illusion. But once you understand how those things work, Kant says, it would be like understanding how the solar system works after Copernicus can explain it to you. Well, okay, so for Kant, we labor under an illusion. We think the world is the way it is, whether we're experiencing it or not. It's an honest mistake, just like saying, it's an honest mistake to think the sun is going around you. It's just not correct. All philosophers before Kant, including David Hume, thought that reason was like a flashlight. In fact, the literature always refers to, the philosophers always talk about how things appear in the natural light of reason. So reason is like a flashlight. The world's the way it is, just the way it is, without you doing anything. And if you have reason, it's like being able to light it up, take a look at it to see how it is in the way it is in itself. Seems like that. It's like going into a cave. If it's pitch black, you can't see anything. You turn on the flashlight and you see the stalagmites and stalactites. They were there before you turned your flashlight on. They're still going to be there when you turn your flashlight off. They're just the way they are. Kant says that is an honest error that people make, thinking that your mind works like a flashlight that lights up the world. It's an honest mistake, but it's an illusion. Right? Truth for Kant is not found out there in the world with your flashlight, but it's found in the structure of reason itself. Reason is not like a flashlight, but it's more like a cookie cutter or a shaper or a former of experience. And how the world is without your shaper or former or your cookie cutter that stomps into the dough and turns out little cookies that look like Christmas trees or stars or moons or stuff like that. You don't find the Christmas trees and stars and moons in the dough. It's just dough. Kant's saying the same thing. What the world is like without your cookie cutter or your shaper, we have no idea how to say it. Now, what's your cookie cutter look like? Well, this is a pretty elaborate slide, but just so you know, there's three elements to this shaper. The world as it is in itself, Kant calls the noumenal world, and the world the way it appears to your mind, he calls the phenomenal world. And the noumenal world, the way the world is without you, he says, well, you experience it, first of all, in terms of space and time. Space is not a thing that you experience things spatially. Time is not a thing that you can experience. You experience things temporally or through time. And if you thought about it, just experiencing, say, a basketball, if that experience didn't last any amount of time whatsoever, you wouldn't be experiencing a basketball. If the basketball was not given to you spatially, parts outside of parts, in extension, as Descartes would say, it's no experience of a basketball at all. And then he says other things like, when you experience things spatially and temporally, you also experience them under certain categories. He thought there were 12 of them, but he says you don't experience substance, but substantially. You don't experience a cause, like Hume said, out there in the world, but you experience things as caused. You can't not do that. Anytime something if something were to happen to you that felt like a miracle, it would make your brain sizzle, because your brain would be demanding the peace and calm that would come from thinking this thing must have a cause. So anything that you ever experience that seems miraculous or uncaused really bothers you, because that's the foundation for your experiencing anything at all. You experience things as numerable. You don't experience a vague quantity of book. You experience a book, one book, or 5 books, or 1,000 books. Or even if you had books that you couldn't count, you would believe in principle they were countable. There was some number of books in the library, let's say. You can't help it. That's the way you experience things. And then finally he says there are certain ideas that without these ideas you couldn't make sense as a totality. Things would not make sense. And he says God is one of those things. There must be an idea of a first cause. He doesn't mean you'll find God out there in the world. It's a condition of possibility of your experiencing anything. Soul. You can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear a soul, but Kant says you need the idea of a soul, an immortal soul, to make sense of ethics, let's say, where all wrongs have to ultimately be righted. It's an idea you have to have, he wants to argue, in order to make sense of it. It's built in. You don't even choose to have it. You just have it as a rational being. And then one other interesting idea is this idea of the noumenal world itself. The fact that there's a world as it is in itself, beyond how it seems to us, is an idea, but it's nothing you could ever experience. It's a condition of possibility of your experiencing anything at all. When you and I are in a room and I say, hey, look at that book, you say, that one right there? I say, yeah, that's the one I mean. We assume that there's a world out there beyond us. We can't not do that. We couldn't ever communicate or experience things together without that idea. But if Kant wants to say, okay, but what's that book like without you or me experiencing? The answer is I have no idea what you're even talking about. I can't answer that question. So what are some of the lessons from Kant? Well, he says reason contributes to what experience is like. It does not find a world ready-made without reason. Rationality forms the world. The structure of reason, that filter or shaper, and he goes into very elaborate detail, we don't have time for all that, determines what our experience has to be like. Now, yeah, if we're experiencing a hot fudge sundae, I may really love those. You may not love those. So I'm not going to say our experience at that level is the same. You have different memories of hot fudge sundaes from your childhood than I have, let's say. But the fact that there's an object in front of us has to be experienced in exactly the same kind of way. Can't help it. That's because we're built the same way rationally. The structure of reason is the condition of possibility of any experience at all. Kant calls his philosophy critical philosophy, or philosophy of critique. Let me define those terms for you. Critical philosophy or critique does two things. One, it shows the limits of something. When you critique something, technically in philosophy, you're showing the limits of things, the limits of things. So in metaphysics, for instance, Kant says there's a limit when you talk about God, because God is not something you can experience like you can experience a book or a coffee cup. So when people talk about experiencing God in that kind of way, Kant says they're making a mistake. They've gone past the limits of what we can say rationally. That's one meaning of critique. The other meaning is to show the conditions of possibility of something. And again, Kant's critical philosophy says, what does it take to be able to experience anything as a rational being? And what it takes is that cookie cutter, that former or shaper that we saw that has the two sensuous intuitions of space and time, the 12 categories of understanding, and a number of ideas of reason. That's what it takes for you and me to be able to experience the world the way that we do. That's critical philosophy. So we have no idea, Kant says, what the world in itself, the noumenal world, without our kind of rational experience is like. That is Kant's solution to Hume's skepticism. God, the soul, causality, substance, the world in itself, these are part of the shape of our shaper, the structure of reason, the way our filter is made. They are not things you experience in the world. They are the way your experience works. So when we do physical science, Kant would say, we are at the very same time discovering how our experience works. Physics, if you're not a Kantian, is about the way the world is. Physics, if you're a Kantian, is about the way human rational beings have to experience the world in its basic structure. So it's as much about us as it is about the world. It's much about the subject as it is about the object. And this is the basis for idealism, the philosophical idea that what we know are our ideas and not the world per se. When we know about the world, and even in physics, what we know in physics is really knowing about our own knowing. This is part of this epistemological turn in philosophy. Okay, so the implications for morality are these. In the ancient definition of substance, a human person is a substantial being with his or her own nature, and that nature, or essence, or form, tells the human person how it's best for it to be. And being what a thing is and the good, how it's best for it to be, are intimately tied together on that ancient view of substance. But that definition of substance changed, and in the modern definition of substance, being and the good are severed from each other. The is and the ought have nothing to do with each other. And even in our universities, we're supposed to practice value-free science, where we don't make judgments about how things are or why people are doing things. We just objectively describe what's going on, what is, and never try to say what ought to be. We don't believe that we ought to do that anymore. But for the ancient view, is and ought are tied together. In Kantian thought, it makes an attempt to save ethics from the modern view that separates being and the good by finding the good in the structure of reason alone and not out there in the world of being where Humean skepticism reigns. Kant is trying to ground morality and rationality to guard against the consequences of Hume's skepticism. It's using critique, showing the limits and showing the conditions of possibility as a method to defeat Hume's skepticism. I'll just give you one example. Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, said if God is dead, everything is permitted. In other words, God is the ground of morality. If there's no God to judge your immortal soul, then Dostoevsky thinks you'll just run amok. You'll just do everything because there's no cosmic cop and court to penalize you. All right. Hume says there's no God. Well, you put Dostoevsky and Hume together in an argument. Dostoevsky says if there's no God, everything's permitted. Hume says there's no God. The conclusion would be everything is permitted. It means there is no morality. There is no ethics. For Kant, that was unconscionable. It's unacceptable. He says, all right, suppose they really show there's no God. Would that have to be the end of ethics? No. The answer is right and wrong are part of the conditions of possibility of your experiencing the human world of interaction at all. When somebody does something, you know, because you're rationally experiencing it, whether the person has done the right thing or done the wrong thing. And everything we're going to talk about after this in our discussion of Kant is going to be how we know that, how we understand that. All right, so that's what he's after. If God were to stop existing, or if there's not really some pre-built human nature out there, at least we're rational. There's no doubting that. And rationality is not nothing. It's not just a lamp that finds things as they are. No, rationality is a determiner of experience, including moral experience. So we have to look at Kant's rational morality to understand, as he'll put it, what our duties are and how we know whether a certain thing, it really is a duty or not, and how we fulfill our duties. And we're going to find that morality for Kant becomes absolutely absolute in its claim to universality. We are all equally rational beings, therefore we all have the same fundamental morality. Even considering that there are different cultures and different practices, Kant's going to give us a technique for criticizing even our own culture, even our own methods of satisfying our appetites and desires, even our own endeavors to be happy. Kant's going to say there's a right way to do those things and there's a wrong way, and we know it because we're rational.